Thanks everyone for coming on short notice. It's nice to see some friends, old and new, in the room. If you've been here before, you know this is the Jamie Kennedy Gilead Cafe. It is our home away from home, our constant temptation, because you know that our office is just at the end of this laneway, and I spend all day staring at the Gilead sign and knowing that nice folks are here to ply you with all kinds of good food and drink. But they make this space available to us each month when we're fortunate enough to be able to invite some interesting people who are either in Toronto or passing through Toronto to come and talk to us about some of the things that they're working on or thinking about or have recently published and that we all want to buy before we leave.
Yeah, Peter is too polite to say this, but if you guys don't buy this book, he's stuck with it. And he can't afford that, so you got to take him off the book.
Yeah. Help me out.
Help a brother out.
So last night we were at the Center for Social Innovation. We did a big event, had a good conversation, but we wanted to have a more focused, more intimate occasion this evening. I want to just briefly introduce our guest, Alan, because he is someone who I think has really had his finger on the pulse of what Fast Company first called the business revolution in America. And the first edition of Fast Company came out, it feels like yesterday, but it was 1995. And it had on its cover this manifesto, which we were talking about later yesterday, about just how prescient it really was. In fact, it seems almost commonplace now, but it said on the cover, work is personal, computing is social. 1995, this was like summer, this wasn't even Napster yet, but computing is social, knowledge is power, break the rules.
Right. Which then led to people going to jail. Enron. The last one may have been a little bit, you know.
You had to specify.
A bridge too. We should have said, you know, bend the, or write rules of thumb, or something instead of break the rules.
Yeah.
People got carried away. What are you going to do?
Well, you came out with another cover, I think 2 years later, and that one told people to quit your job, work your butt off, and be prepared to screw up.
Yeah, well, the thing about that cover that was fun was the art director had the words quit, work, and screw. And it was our attempt to use false advertising for people to think it was a sex issue.
Yeah.
It didn't work. We didn't sell it.
Normal readership.
Normal readership. So they're just fake. It's not real. But it was a good cover.
It was a good cover.
We actually pioneered the idea of all type covers for about 5 years. We had no pictures. We look at business magazines, or most magazines, they all sell pictures of beautiful people on the cover. And we decided to be different, and we had typographic covers until the magazine was sold, and then they quickly put people on the cover.
Now, just out of curiosity, how many people were reading Fast Company in kind of 1995 to 2000?
Show of hands.
Show of hands. Oh, that's all right. Yeah, so we've got some, you know, oldies but goodies.
At least three. At least three.
Yeah.
Goofy was reading it in Denmark, so he,
I reviewed it, so it actually was printed.
that's true. Goofy got the first beta issue in his hands because the Chaos Pilots had some people in San Francisco, and they carried it back to Denmark, and Goofy called me up and said, is this magazine still publishing? Now, we hadn't even launched yet, but he said, is it still publishing? And I have adopted as a policy the notion that you don't answer questions you aren't asked. So he didn't say, has it launched? He says, are you still publishing? And the answer to that was yes. We weren't out of business. So I said, yes, we're still publishing. So Ufi wrote this terrific article in a Danish newspaper about this fantastic new US-based business magazine, Fast Company. We hadn't launched it. But he lavished praise all over it, and then we became fast friends after that. And when the magazine did launch, I wrote about this fantastic new school for social entrepreneurs called the Chaos Pilots. And one thing led to another, and it's been about a 20-year friendship.
Now, you started, I mean, you were in city politics out in Portland. begin. You helped turn that city around and set it on this very
Almost,
different course.
almost single-handedly.
Almost. You went to the Department of Transportation, Washington,
Yes,
and were involved there, and then you ended up at HBR
correct.
in its own sort of golden age under a very enlightened editor.
Yeah.
But you were also picking up some weak signals of some stories that you wanted to tell that you couldn't tell at the HBR.
True.
So take us a little bit through the sort of genesis of Fast Company.
Sure.
Because then I want to ask you about what's changed. Because the business revolution has hit two big speed bumps. The first was the dot-com bust, and the second is this recession that we're living with right now.
Well, and if you want to add, I was only joking, well, I wasn't joking, but the whole Enron era of excess, scandal, corporate misbehavior, malfeasance that followed the dot-com bust also put a big dent in the notion that business leaders in America were playing the game by different rules. They were playing games by rules that resemble very much subprime lending,
Right.
false accounting, absconding with the money, and so on. So there's at least, you could probably say 3 or more speed bumps
Right.
since Fast Company.
Then 3 strikes, you're out.
No, only in baseball. In business,
Okay.
there appear to be almost an endless number of strikes. Different group goes to jail each time.
Tell us about the story you were trying to tell back in the 90s.
Well, it was a fair question. What happened was in 1989, so it's a long time ago, literally it's 20 years ago, I was the beneficiary of a fellowship from the Japan Society in New York. It's hard to remember 1989. Most of you probably weren't born yet in 1989, but if you were, 1989 was kind of the peak of the Japanese bubble. A friend of mine, Ezra Vogel at Harvard, had written Japan as #1, how the Japanese were outperforming the United States economically. Manufacturing was changing the face of the global economy. They had this incredible thing called industrial policy that we didn't have. And in the wake of all that, I got a chance to go over to Japan for 3 months, courtesy of the Japan Society, and take a little sabbatical from the Harvard Business Review. And while I was there, I ended up meeting with a generation of leaders cutting across the society horizontally. People in business, people in government, people in the permanent bureaucracy, academics, journalists, and interviewing about what they thought was going on in the world. And when I got back to the United States, I identified 4 themes that I thought were really emerging. Globalization, the fact that boundaries between countries meant less and less. Technology, the digital revolution was coming out of the laboratories of these Japanese companies. I remember vividly going to one company and having the CEO demonstrate for me, now this seems like old hat today, but in 1989, demonstrating for me how he could take a photograph, put it onto his computer, migrate it to a fax machine. That was a big deal, fax machines in those days. Put it onto his printer, hit print, and have a hard copy of this photograph that moved through all these different digital stages. And it occurred to me that all work would be personal and portable and digital. There was a generational shift. Baby boomers then, this is 20 years ago, so baby boomers who were 60 now were 40 then. Bill Clinton was becoming president of the United States. George Bush the first was moving off the stage. The World War II generation in business and in politics was kind of out of power, with boomers replacing them. And boomers worked for different reasons. People in the World War II generation worked because of the Great Depression. And they remembered that if you didn't work, you didn't have food on the table. Boomers took it for granted you would have food on the table, and the motivation was not to make a living, but to make a difference. So a flip in Maslow's hierarchy. And then the last was diversity. That increasingly, I had this image in my mind when I got back to Boston after being in Japan. If you took an elevator ride up most office buildings in the United States and got off at any floor and looked around the offices, I'm not talking about factories, I'm talking about white collar work. The number of women working in those offices would be 60% of the workforce. In 1989, the number of people, women going to business school, women going to law school, women going to medical school started to almost reach the 50% mark in terms of the demographics. And yet, if you picked up business magazines then and just leafed through them, the photographs were all men. So it was as if reality were not reflected in the pages of the reporting on what business was doing. So those four crosscuts were things that I was acutely aware of coming back from that sabbatical in Japan. And we put some of it into HBR, but HBR was not about that kind of sociological or psychographic approach to interpreting business. HBR was about the architecture of the Harvard Business School, finance, HR, strategy, and so on. And so it was very difficult to when you have those categories you have to play within, it's very difficult to open a new line of argument about how the world was changing. So ultimately, around 92, I left HBR and with my friend Bill Taylor, who had come over from MIT, where he had run the MIT management magazine as a student. We began to write the business plan for Fast Company, and those crosscuts were embedded in the business plan.
And there are a number of people who are starting up different organizations in the room here. Tell us about the business plan experience. Like, did people get it when you took them this idea for a magazine?
Well, it was interesting. We started out. I actually am carrying with me in my bag on my travels. I've been on the road for about a month now, moving around the U.S., Europe, Scandinavia, Canada. And in my bag is the Fast Company business plan. I've been rereading it. And we opened up, page 1 says, the world of business is divided today between those who get it and those who don't. And those who get it see just how dramatically the world is changing, and that business is the force for change. We really focused hard on writing a narrative for the business plan, and we rewrote it, I don't know, 20 times to try to really address what we thought was going on. And not just to raise the money, but to test our own thinking through the business plan. And in my New York Times #1 bestseller, well, maybe not, anyway, in this book, there are a number of lessons that derive directly from that experience. One of the things I wrote in this book is that when you're starting a company, and I learned this when we raised the money to do the test of Fast Company. I wrote Speak of the Devil and His Dollars Appear. I said in this book that not all money is created equal, and that you have to find investors who have patience, they have wisdom, they have Rolodexes, they have great political experience, they are friendly, they are knowledgeable.
This is the best introduction I've ever had.
Tom Axworthy.
One of our first round investors was the one and only Tom Axworthy. We decided when we were going after our investors, we thought Fast Company was going to be global. So we have to have people who are not just in the United States. Who better than a Canadian leading political intellectual to be a first round investor? So we had Canadian money, we had Japanese money, and we asked investors not only to give us their dollars, denominated in US dollars, but also to give us their advice, their literally their Rolodexes, their suggestions, their feedback. But we also didn't want investors who were thought they were going to run the magazine, who thought they were in charge of the editorial policy. So we had, by the time we were done, we raised about $550,000, and we had the perfect set of investors. We wrote design specs for the investors the way you write design specs for a house, a building, anything that you're designing. And we ended up with a group of investors who had reputational capital, they had experience, we said this was going to be a magazine for thought leaders. The investors were thought leaders. We said it was going to be a magazine for people who were practical, hands-on business people. We had business leaders, we had academic leaders, we had consultants. We basically sculptured the investment to match the magazine. And that was a very important step, because I think when you're a startup, most people are so desperate for money, you think all money is created. If I just get enough money to try my idea, it doesn't matter where it comes from. And in fact, it all matters. Everything matters. If you want your project to succeed, you have to make your best effort to make every element the way you think it should be. You may be wrong, you may get some of it wrong and some of it right, but your job is to be as scrupulous as you can, whether it's about the money, or hiring a great design director, or the way you produce your business plan.
Good rules of thumb.
It is really it is a rule of thumb for me that everything communicates. Your business card communicates. Your job title communicates. Your investment group communicates.
And that was one of the things that I think so many people found really striking about Fast Company. Like you mentioned already, it didn't have photographs of business titans leaning left, right? Strong jaw.
To the right.
To the right. Right.
Yeah.
But you got the sense that there was something really aspirational about the publication, and from the very first line of the business plan, you were setting out a different narrative. Do you feel as much confidence, though, today after those 3 speed bumps or strikes or whatever they are, about the transformative power of American business, that it is driving the larger social narrative in the way that you hoped it would in the 90s?
Well, if I were writing the business plan today, and actually this is why I've been rereading the business plan to see how it stands up and what I would do differently today. If I were writing the business plan today, I think I would change a very key part of the proposition. In 1992, 93, when we wrote it, it said, a revolution is changing the world, and business is driving that revolution. Today, I would say a revolution is changing the world, and social business is driving that revolution. That companies come and companies go, and there are some great startups that have happened since Fast Company was launched that are really aspirational and that are enormously successful. But the movement today that is as powerful as the new economy was in 93, 94, 95, the comparable movement today is not a private sector movement, it's a hybrid movement between a hybrid between a business and a social purpose. And I've been on a learning journey for the last 4 years or so, traveling literally from South America to Asia to Europe, and everywhere I go, I run into remarkable people of all ages. A 21-year-old kid at Georgetown who is teaching classes to his colleagues in school. He's a senior at Georgetown. He has 140 of his fellow students enrolled in a program to teach them how to do social enterprise management. After being told by the dean when he enrolled and he wanted to major in social enterprise management at Georgetown, the dean told him there's no demand for that subject. He started his own program, has 140 of his fellow students enrolled in the program, and they've started 9 social businesses on campus. To a recent visit where I was in Austria. I told you this yesterday. I was in Austria. There was a conference at a Benedictine monastery focusing on bridging the gap between the rich and the poor in Austria. Quite a remarkable conference. At the end of it, I sat down to have supper with some of the attendees, and a young man, maybe 10, 20 years younger than me, sat down next to me, very nicely dressed, very well-mannered, introduced himself as Benedict Metternich, a name that will resonate with some of you who have studied the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think it was his great-grandfather or great-grandfather who was the famous Count Metternich of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Perhaps not a man who is a hero to some people. This Metternich is spending his time in Africa helping do economic development for poor Africans. Major shift in family fortune from assassination and political intrigue to social policy and helping poor people raise their sights.
You know, I agree with you on much of this stuff, but I sometimes get worried that all of the attention being paid to social ventures and social business actually is going to create a similar bubble of expectations that surrounded the sort of emancipatory message of, you know, corporate America to really change the game. I mean, one of the big issues with many of these ventures is scale. And so I'm wondering, where is government in all of this? Because that's actually where you started.
I did, and actually when I got into city government in Portland, it was right at a moment when the city was at a strategic inflection point. Portland in 1971, 72 could have turned into a mini LA, or it could have turned into what it is today, which is perhaps the most livable city in the United States. And like Toronto, at one point, the issue was a freeway. We were faced with a freeway that Jane Jacobs' nemesis, Robert Moses, had drawn on the map of Portland, Oregon. And it's an interesting historical echo. After World War II, the city fathers of Portland, Oregon hired Moses to come out and design a transportation map for Portland, Oregon. The map he drew, surprise, surprise, consisted largely of freeways. And in fact, when I worked in the mayor's office, we did a calculation that said if all of the freeways that Moses wrote on the map had been built, 1 out of every 10 houses in Portland, Oregon would either have been destroyed by a freeway or be directly adjacent to a freeway if they'd all been built. We had a freeway controversy, the Mount Hood Freeway, and the mayor for whom I worked was able to convince the city council to withdraw the freeway, use the funds to build transit, light rail instead. It was part of a regional planning process, part of a downtown planning process, part of a statewide land use planning process that really triggered Portland's birth into a city that is walkable, sustainable, livable, humane. The downtown is alive and thriving. Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities is a textbook for the street life, the office building requirements to put retail at the ground floor. It is a living example of following commonsensical, humane land use planning. Now, what's happening with government today? Well, you see what's happening in the federal government, where there's a legitimate effort, I think, by President Obama to engage in what I would consider one of the first things that government should be responsible for, and something that you do for a living, and that is engage people in a conversation about their future. The man I worked for, the mayor, was in people's living rooms 3 nights a week, having coffees and listening to what the citizens of Portland wanted. On the first Sunday of every month, he was on television, taking calls from listeners and viewers who would ask questions about everything from potholes to dog control about the city. And by the time he was done going into these coffees, he knew about every pothole in the city of Portland. And he could talk about potholes, or he could talk about public education and the importance of that for the city's economic development, or linking public education to land use planning, or the whole kind of intricate system of thinking that a city really is. So I think it starts with what you do for a living, what Obama's trying to do at the national level, which is very hard at that scale, and that is engage in public conversation so that people feel like they have a stake in the discussion and they can actually participate in a meaningful way. That said, I think what's important about social business or social entrepreneurship is that it is part public and part private. It is a hybrid. And I talk about it in rules of thumb a little bit. I use the metaphor of cutting a problem on the diagonal. We tend to think about problems in categories or in images, old mental models. So you have public here and you have private here. And the axes intersect, but then they diverge. And most of our thinking about public issues fall along this axis and private issues fall along this axis. But what if you cut it on the diagonal so that you're able to rearrange your mental thinking sort of the way a bishop does on a chessboard? And rather than moving square to square with your pawns, you play the game on the diagonal and you bring new lines of sight into the hybrid thinking that really rearranges how you solve a problem. That's, to me, the exciting part of social enterprise. You're right about the prospects for a bubble. On my learning journey, I spent some time in New York with a friend of mine who is a very smart venture philanthropist who's been investing in social businesses. I'll give you an example. One of his projects I think is absolutely brilliant. It probably wouldn't relate too much to Toronto or to Canada, but in the US it's a big problem. And that's gunshots in city neighborhoods. There are lots of city neighborhoods in the United States where you wouldn't want to be, and where gunfire is heard pretty frequently. And when a gun goes off, typically what people who live there is go inside, shut the door, and hope it goes away. The last thing they want to do is get involved. They don't want to pick up the phone and call the police, and they don't want to be identified as having anything to do with it. What my friend is invested in is a company that has a technology that puts sound detectors on buildings and on telephone poles in inner city neighborhoods. And when a gunshot goes off, the sound is detected and triangulated, and a phone call immediately goes to the police. Nobody has to make a call. The call is made automatically. This technology has already saved something like 400 lives of people in various cities in the United States where a gunshot has gone off. The call goes to the police, they get there in time to get an ambulance, and somebody who's been shot is saved. And at the same time, the neighborhood gets safer because people actually know that there will be a call going to the police. They are less fearful. That's a public good with a private enterprise operation. He's invested in that. I think it's a pretty good project.
But a project that's also catching things so far downstream, which may be some savvier, more substantial public investment upstream.
It's not. It doesn't stop people from getting shot, but it does stop people from dying when they do get shot.
Right.
Now, his advice is, this is a good thing, but watch out for the bubble, as you said. What happens when people start investing in more and more public businesses, social businesses, and discover that it's both profitable and satisfying? Will we get the same thing that happened with the .com? Well, will you see too much money chasing too few good ideas?
Right.
And it could happen. I mean, in America,
The pets.com social business.
yeah, you got a sock puppet instead of a
Social service. Yeah.
Ted Levitt, when he was the editor of the Harvard Business Review, used to say, anything in excess is a poison. And you could have an excess of investment in social businesses. And it may well happen. I don't think you can prevent it. But on the other hand, if you've got more and more people genuinely interested in trying to make a positive impact on problems in the world, that's a bubble that I'm willing to take a risk on.
Well, I can pepper you with a few more questions about the relationship between public and private realm and the role of regulation in all of this, but I know there are a bunch of questions probably in the audience here, so why don't we open it up and turn it into a wider discussion.
Hi, Tom. How you been? It's nice to see you. You look good.
Came in from Halifax just for this.
I am so honored.
Is this a good investment, Tom?
It's my version of social investment.
And it worked. It actually worked. We warned you when in our business. So you're talking about our business plan. When we wrote the business plan, the cover said, "My mother warned me not to invest in a magazine, a restaurant, or a Broadway show."
Yeah.
And then you turned the page over and said, "Here's your chance to invest in a magazine." But it was proven advertising, right? There was no, it was very transparent.
Just on that, Alan, you talked a little bit about the government, of course. This has been a very successful magazine, but give us your thoughts on publishing day and newspapers. I mean, you come out of that whole era, as I do.
Yes, you do.
And what's happening there? I mean, we're seeing newspapers closing everywhere, magazines, ads are falling, no one's figured out how to make a nickel off of the web. What's the story? What's going to happen?
And I should say we've got the Globe and Mail, Canadian Business, and the Literary Review of Canada all waiting for your answer.
It's a great job. It's a great industry, and I endorse it. No, I'll tell you, Tom. I don't know if you saw today that the New York Times has decided it's not going to sell the Boston Globe. Not going to sell the Globe. Now, there are two ways to interpret that. One is their official statement, which is the Globe's doing better, and the other is you couldn't get anything for it anyway. Business Week was sold yesterday for what, $2 million? It's just, I think that's a crime. Business Week is a hugely, if somebody asked me to take over Business Week and try to make it work, I think there's an enormous opportunity to make it work. The problem, this goes back to Ted Levin, and it's one of my favorite rules. When people ask me what I like among my own rules, one of them is the rule that says if you want to see with fresh eyes, reframe the picture. And it goes back to a piece that Ted Levitt wrote in the Harvard Business Review 30 years ago called Marketing Myopia. Ted wrote that the problem with the railroads in America was they thought they were in the railroad business when they should have seen they were in the transportation business. And he had an even better line than that. He said there was a company that made home repair tools, and they thought they were selling drills, but their customers were buying holes. Now, the problem with most newspapers and magazines in the United States is that they think they're in the magazine business, or they think they're in the newspaper business. And the news tends today to be a commodity. And commodities are, by definition, not particularly valuable. Scarcity increases value, and commodities are the opposite of a scarce entity. So what business could a newspaper or a magazine be in? And what newspapers or magazines are thriving? Well, The Economist is doing really well. But they're not in the news business. They're in the perspective business. They're in the meaning-making business. The Financial Times is doing well. They offer commentary, a different point of view. Jon Stewart is doing very well.
Fox is doing well, and this is the perspective that the argument made for Fox.
Fox has its niche viewership, and they are loyal. Jon Stewart is the #1 rated newsman in America. This is hilarious because he defines himself as a comedian. Right. So what is he offering? He's offering insight off the news. It's funny, but it's also savage commentary. The Onion is enormously successful. The Onion is funny. There's a piece in the Times about a month ago about a French website that is kind of a French version of The Onion that is so successful as a website, they're now launching a paper version. People will pay for insight, humor, perspective, commentary, various things that are, sometimes they'll pay for muckraking still. They want investigative journalism that breaks stories. People will pay for that.
So is that subscription, Alan, or advertising?
It's going to be a mix of both. I think ultimately, the other thing, I wrote a piece that appeared, I posted on the Huffington Post. I said, all right, if Ted Levitt is right, and newspapers and magazines think they're in the newspaper or magazine business and they're wrong, what other businesses could they be in? They could be in the same business that American Express used to be in. Remember the American Express slogan, membership has its privileges? What if you're not a subscriber, but you're a member of a newspaper or a magazine, and with different membership levels, you get different privileges? What if you're in the talk show business, and you not only have a print product and a web product, but you've got the opportunity for people to call in and engage in dialogue and conversation with editors or columnists or authors or management? Why do you cover what you cover? Why was that on your front page? What do you think is, it becomes a dialogue with the reader rather than a monologue.
And this reminds me of one of the oddest and smartest guys who worked at your magazine with their wonderful name, Heath Rowe.
Mr. Airport.
Mr. Airport, yeah. Who ran your company of friends.
Yes.
What did company of friends teach you about this whole issue of membership?
Well,
Because at its height, how many?
we had
There's thousands.
we had chapters, or what did he call them?
Company of friends.
Yeah, but what did he call it? He had a language system all of his own.
He's a quirky guy.
His job title was social capitalist. and the idea of company of friends was
95.
everything that is virtual should also be visceral. And that if you are creating a community, which is what a magazine does, a great magazine creates a community. Small sidebar on that. When we were starting Fast Company, I went through a little educational process of my own and did some research on, decade by decade, the most successful magazines in the United States. So if you look at The New Yorker, launched after World War I, what was the success factor in The New Yorker? Well, its editor and founder famously said, this is a magazine that is not for the little old lady from Dubuque. It's for people who are sophisticated, who are coming back from World War I. America is becoming a power in the world. It wants to be sophisticated. It wants to be wise and kind of savvy. You have the Algonquin Round Table. It was a taste arbiter. And it created a community of people who said, we're going to read the smartest writing that America can produce. That's the 1910s, 20s. You end up with Fortune, launched, interestingly enough, in 1929.
A heroic publication at its height.
A brilliant magazine that, when it was launched, was not a business magazine, it was a business sociology magazine. Issue 1, Volume 2, Ernest Hemingway writing about the economics of bullfighting. A brilliant photo essay on the disassembly line of a hog butchering process, where you watch them deconstruct a pig step by step in a butchery factory. Brilliant stuff, not business per se, but business sociology, because in 29, 30, 31, you had the rise of corporate America for the first time. I went and looked at what it took to launch Rolling Stone, created a community of people who believed in drugs, sex, and rock and roll, something that we can all rally around. What was the rallying cry of Playboy? Enormously successful magazine that said, there's a sexual revolution going on, men need to know how to dress, how to mix a drink. They don't know how to do it, they're clueless. Hugh Hefner will create a magazine for a community of men who want to be cool. Every decade had a magazine that created a community that didn't know it was a community. It was waiting to be identified by the magazine itself. So the magazine became almost the strange attractor around which the community formed. And early on in the history of Fast Company, I had this notion that the magazine would almost be like the stamp you get when you go into a nightclub and you put it under the black light and it would show that you've been stamped. People would get on an airplane and they'd open Fast Company and somebody else would say, oh, you're a member of the club. You read that magazine too. That's the community. Well, when we launched it, a year into it, we got an email from some reader in Columbus, Ohio saying, I'm out here in Columbus, Ohio. Are there any other readers in Columbus, Ohio? Light bulb. What if we created an opportunity for our readers to get together with each other? What if we formed the Chamber of Commerce of the future, where in city by city people could find their like-minded individuals who could use the magazine as a point of departure for a conversation about the subjects that they cared about together. We ended up with chapters in Paris. I went to a Paris Company of Friends meeting, Tokyo. I still bump into people today who say, I can't believe that the Company of Friends doesn't exist anymore. I had so many people I met and we shared so many great ideas. We had people getting married who met at Company of Friends. And it really was a network of like-minded individuals who cared about similar things. They didn't have to work in the same companies, the same businesses, the same industries. It was psychographic. They shared aspirations, values, and passion for this changing world of work. And Heath Rowe, Mr. Airport, as he was lovingly known, he was the impresario of the Company of Friends.
Constantly in motion.
And we even had summits. So each chapter had its own organizer who was in charge of getting people to the meeting, organizing speakers. We said, well, these people are doing, the Lord's work. Let's get them to a summit meeting and let them talk to each other. And we put on two different conferences where we brought these people together. Those folks loved the magazine. They loved what it stood for, and they loved what it enabled them to do with people they met in their own community. And it became really a grassroots movement. Why companies, why organizations don't do that? Why they don't see that they are profoundly political? It goes back to the question about government and the public sector. I honestly don't see that much difference between companies and government elected officials.
Rule number 2.
I thought of myself every day at Fast Company as the mayor of Fast Company. And my job was to run for office every day. By the way I responded to emails from disgruntled subscribers. By the way I talked to ad people who wanted to buy an advertisement. You can't take them for granted. I would interview something I learned in the mayor's office. In the mayor's office in Portland, I came to realize that the most important employee wasn't me. I was writing policy papers. No, that's not the most important job. Most important job in the mayor's office is the receptionist. The receptionist talks to everybody. Everybody calls expecting to be put through to the mayor immediately. And the receptionist has to be explained why we're really sorry. The mayor would love to talk to you, but at the moment, he's tied up. Can somebody else help? And I would interview everybody we hired to be the receptionist at Fast Company, and I would say, you have the most important job in the magazine. You will touch more people than anyone. So if you think your job is trivial and it's just a throwaway job and you don't matter because you're not editing, you are wrong. Our fortune, well, I would never use the word fortune because fortune is the enemy. Our future depends on you.
Right.
And if you don't get it, you can't have the job. And it was a political campaign.
You had some amazing exceptions.
We had great receptions. We had people who were
serious.
really committed to being the best receptionists of any company in America. I love them. I love them. Anybody else?
And
Well, I want to follow on in the government question. It's something that I struggle with, and I work as an advocate, basically, in public education. So, and what we know in public education is the secretary is the most important person in all schools. So it's the same thing.
Same
follows.
deal, yeah.
So when you're talking about social entrepreneurship, and it's, you know, and it's very, it's the thing we're all supposed to aspire to, especially in the not-for-profit sector, because you're supposed to find a way of making a profit and not making a profit at the same time somehow.
That's
Funding
cool.
yourself. Then as a baby, as an old person among people who are mostly much younger, I really am struggling with what I feel like is a kind of innate belief in government, and that government's really important, and government provides equity, and government is the thing that it creates that balance between my sort of private need and the overall public good.
Yep.
But the more and more and more we turn to either social entrepreneurs or the not-for-profit sector, or, I mean, I'm even having a hard time, that's why I like your diagonal, between what's private and what's, because, you know, is the why private, or is the why, you know, a public kind of, is it nice, is it good or bad, maybe let's just put it that way. But so I am really struggling now, because we more and more and more in Canada, which is not what we used to do, look to the not-for-profit sector, to social entrepreneurs, to kind of fill in gaps that we used to assume should be provided by the government. Now, part of me goes, there's some good, really great stuff going on for one thing, and also some of it comes from the community, so isn't that good, because it has that
Right.
kind of, you know, local
Grassrootsy
buy-in,
feel,
yeah, that
yeah.
feel to it, but also that reality that that's good. But are we losing out in a way? And that's what I really struggle with right now. Then I can't decide whether it's my own knee-jerk reaction or whether I really should be worried. Are we losing something by giving up that ground too easily and saying, it's okay, we can do all those things that we used to assume government did? So I want you to talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's a really hard issue right now.
It is a hard issue, and I think your question reflects a lot of the complexity and turbulence that we're going through, not just in deciding who's responsible for what problem, but in trying to figure out how to actually get solutions to some of these problems. So I kind of come at it a different way. My concern is not what are we losing and what are we gaining in different spheres. My concern is, and this is not about Ken, let me be very parochial, this is about how I view the United States. I see us not losing ground in terms of what we ask the government to do, but losing ground in terms of real solutions that work to serious systemic problems. And so, and I hesitate to make a list, because it starts to get depressing if you're susceptible to depression. But when I look at my own country, there's wonderful things going on, and I don't want to make it sound all black or all white. There's a lot of great stuff happening. At the same time, I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. 50% of the kids who start high school drop out. You can't have a society where 50% of the kids drop out of high school. You can't have an economy where 50% of the kids drop out of high school. You can't have a informed public where 50% of the kids drop out of high school. That's what we have in Santa Fe, and we're not unique. We have, in the United States, we spend more money on healthcare than any country in the world, and we rank 13, 14, 15 in the category of infant mortality and mature life expectancy. Some disconnect is happening there that is profoundly not working. So, and I could go on, as could you. So I think, for me at least, as a concerned citizen, my first cut at the issue isn't, am I worried about losing ground for government or not-for-profits? My first concern is, why can't we come up with and implement real solutions that work? And then I take that as the challenge. I believe in pragmatism. But Tom and I may share this. There is nothing worse than losing an election. there's nothing
Losing your soul.
and losing a life.
Wildly.
But you know, I grew. My father. I remember vividly my father weeping when Dwight Eisenhower beat Adlai Stevenson, because my father said, "Will America ever elect an intellectual president?" You know, he was just beside himself. And at that moment, I think I had a lifelong epiphany that losing sucks. And if you really want to implement change, you actually have to win the election. So there's nothing noble and romantic about losing. There's a lot good about winning and keeping your soul and getting to implement your program so you actually create change that works. And I actually kind of part company with President Obama. He's interested in the audacity of hope. I'm interested in the audacity of results. And I think I'm interested in studying anything that works and disengaging the operating principles to find out why they work. And that's what we did at Fast Company. Fast Company, we weren't writing ideology. We were writing entertaining, thoughtful, well-reported case studies of what worked, and then extrapolating the practical lessons that anybody could use in their own work life. I look at the problems that I'm concerned with, and if you look, this is something that I really think is a good exercise. Look at business, government, and not-for-profits through the eyes of the problem. How does the problem view those three categories? And the answer is the problem doesn't care. If you look at educational failure, and you look at kids who are dropping out, do they care about business? No. All they know is that they're not getting their needs met. And what they want is a school that teaches them and helps them succeed, and recognizes that they've got problems of their own, that the educational system dates back to agriculture, and we sit kids in rows like it's a factory, and we don't recognize that only 80% of the people in the world learn by being lectured at. No, flip it. 20% learn by being lectured at, 80% learn by either hands-on experience or sitting next to somebody who can walk them through it, but we still teach by lecture. They don't care about any of that stuff. All they know is it isn't working. Find me somebody who can create a school, whether it's for-profit, not-for-profit, government-run, or a hybrid, where I can actually learn and not feel like a failure every day when I go to school. That's what they want. And that's what Bill Strickland gives them in Pittsburgh. Now, is he a government agency? Well, he takes some money from government. Is he a business? Well, he happens to have a jazz auditorium in his school where the leading jazz players in America have come for the last 20 years. He's won 5, whatever you call them, what do you win for music? Grammys. This guy runs a school, he's won 5 Grammys by putting out the recordings that the musicians made in his school and repatriating the profits to run the school. So is he a business? Yeah. Is he a non-profit? Yeah, he's running a school. He's all three at the same time. Is that cool? I think that's very cool. Right? And from the point of view of the kids who go there, all they know is some guy has created a school that teaches them and they end up going to college. That's what they care about. To me, that's much better than fretting about whose job is it, and so on and so forth. The only other thing I'd add to that is that, this may sound cynical, but I think it's actually very practical. I spent a bunch of years at the Harvard Business School. I was just in Washington, D.C. at a program put on by a different business school. It is unfortunately the case, I think, that most colleges and universities are lagging social indicators. The professors are following the students. Governments are lagging social indicators. Institutions, by their very nature, are probably lagging social indicators. Entrepreneurs, by their very nature, are cutting-edge change agents. So that's why I'm attracted to social entrepreneurs, because they're going to be the point of the spear that prods the other institutions to rethink how they deliver services. It is not an accident that Barack Obama started out as a social organizer, a grassroots organizer. He understands that change really does come from the bottom up, from grassroots people reimagining how you deliver services and becoming their own best advocates and prodding the government or companies, whoever it happens to be, to make changes. So he studied under Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals. Saul Alinsky was preaching to governments and companies, you got to get in step with where the people are. And if you do that, you might get elected and you might have customers. That's what you're teaching. Listen to the customers in a conversation. You got a great shot at adapting. But if you don't adapt, you will be a dinosaur. It is Darwinian.
I got a silly question to close out on, but why don't we take maybe 2 more questions? Anyone?
Or none.
Or none? Yeah, Rachel.
Just a question on your continuum between social entrepreneur and private and public. In Canada, we have a national broadcaster who is currently using taxpayer money to buy reruns of Wheel of Fortune.
Yes, yes. One of my favorite shows.
Sure. But what's the utility of that situation? Where has that gone wrong? And how can we recalibrate so that we're not spending taxpayer dollars, Canadian taxpayer dollars on American reruns in order to build audience?
Boy. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, really.
There are a whole lot of layers to that onion that you'd have to peel back. Like, why are they doing it? What is the problem they think they're solving? Is it a viewership problem? Is it a political problem where they're perceived as being too elitist and they want to prove that they have the salt of the earth on their programming as well? These things are usually, a decision like that is the front behind which a whole bunch of conversations have gone on, none of which I was privy to. But you know, so, you would have to, you know, if you're a taxpayer and you're a viewer or a listener and you object to this, what are your avenues of engagement? What are your opportunities to say, if you're going to buy that, here's what I also want you to buy? What are your opportunities to get into a conversation with that institution so that it is a dialogue and not a monologue or a kind of stonewall of a decision-making process? If they want to ultimately succeed, and this goes back to Tom's question about the media, the media is gonna change. I don't care whether they're taxpayer supported or not. If nobody's listening, watching, engaging, participating, if they're withdrawing support from a public institution because they don't feel that it has legitimacy, they will fail. There's no doubt about it. It may take a while, it may be ugly, painful, slow, but they will fail. And they'll fail because of a question like yours. And if they're not listening to you, you're going to take your attention and apply it somewhere else. Maybe not your tax dollars, but your attention and your loyalty and your conversation. They will gradually have their blood supply cut off. And you've got so many choices through the web, among other things, or through just the button that's off. There is an off button that makes the screen go blank. Increasingly, that's what's happening. If you look at television and radio, the biggest competitor for their eyeballs isn't really the web, it's off. And so they'll fail. And then something else will come along. And maybe they'll also put Wheel of Fortune on, or maybe they'll put something worse on. But
But they'll keep trying.
But they have to adapt. I mean, it really is an amazing. The interesting part. None of this happens without pain, by the way. We all sort of, in America at least, the notion is nobody should have any pain. America is the most anesthetized, pain-filled society on earth. There is a pill to take away every pain that an American could ever experience, as if pain is somehow a bad thing. Well, you know, companies have pain every day because they lose customers, they lose money, that they're in pain. And I would argue that that's a really good thing. When you stop feeling pain, you're out of touch with reality.
Right, but then if you have this backstop of a public-private hybrid, then you have a moral hazard, because you don't necessarily have the pain of losing your market share if you have taxpayer dollars or some form of government structure that will.
Well, you'll still get funded, but you won't have an audience. And people will be making programming for the web or their own channels or whatever evolves over time that simply renders these people irrelevant. One of the lines I have in my book is that if you don't, you know, you have a choice: irrelevancy or adaptation. And irrelevancy, believe me, if you're a broadcaster or a media person, irrelevancy is worse than death. I mean, it is a vote of no confidence and a vote of, talking about moral hazard, it's a vote of moral irrelevance. And you die from shame. It's very painful death.
We have lots of people living here just fine. In the media business, we have lots of people, I think, in the media business here that are supported in some of that I don't think they mind irrelevance.
Well, you have to increase the pain factor. No, I'm serious.
Yeah, I mean, you don't just increase the pain factor.
No, not just. You have to do it. Not just do it. Do it. There is a way to make the status quo very uncomfortable. People do it all the time. I mean, I don't know if you've read Rules for Radicals, but it is a phenomenal textbook on increasing the pain factor for the status quo. And what's happened is we've all sort of, I think, my brother Axworthy and I are of a generation where people actually went out and marched in the street. You let your displeasure be known. I know it's rude, and I know Canadians don't like to be rude, but if you really want to make change happen, my rule of thumb about change is a math formula. It says change happens when the cost of the status quo is greater than the risk of change. Now you're making the status quo way too comfortable for people.